the order of this evening's events will be a lovely reading with Andrea Ross, and then a question and answer, an open mic, some time to sign books, buy books if you'd like to buy some of Andrea's books, and that will conclude the evening's events. This program is recorded, it is streaming live, and the live stream will end at after the Q&A. And if you would like to come up and sign up to read, the sign-up sheet is right over here. And I think that's everything. So I'll go ahead and introduce Andrea Ross. And my name is also Patricia Kaspers Ross, but we are no relation, just so you know. Andrea Ross's memoir, Unnatural Selection, about her years as a wilderness guide searching for her biological family, was published in 2021. Her writing has appeared in Ploughshares, the Huffington Post, Terrain, The Conversation, Bay Nature, Mountain Gazette, and she's been featured on many podcasts about writing, wilderness travel, and adoption. During the 1980s and 1990s, Andrea worked throughout the American West as a wilderness guide, a National Park Service ranger, and a backcountry search and rescue captain. She is a faculty member in the university writing program at UC Davis. And I'm just going to read you a little bit from the foreword of her book. So here is Unnatural Selection. That's this astoundingly personal and public book, a long intimacy, a sleeping pad carried to a clearing near the campfire, where we can settle in and look up at the night sky, its vast constellations like so many blood cells pulsing through the universe, each one containing unique flaws and mysteries. Biology makes a family. Biology doesn't make a family. The experience of being an adopted person makes both of these statements true. With a poet's language of memoir, Andrea Ross searches for the phantom, the fantasy, the stories we know are there, if only we can find the first stone. Oh, and that is Miriam Peskovitz, New York Times bestselling author of The Daring Book for Girls. Please help me welcome Andrea Ross.
Thank you so much, Patricia. I'm so thrilled to be here. It's lovely to be invited, and it's lovely to see so many people here. And thank you for the lovely introduction. So that covers a lot of things that I don't have to tell you about what I'm going to read today. I am going to read from the book, and as she mentioned, I brought some copies if you want to buy it. If you're intrigued and want to buy a copy of it afterwards, I'd be happy to provide you with that. So the section that I'm going to read from today takes place on a rafting trip. Partially. Has anybody been on a rafting trip recently? We're up here by the water. Yeah. So you'll recognize some of the things that happen in this, although this is a rafting trip through the Grand Canyon. So this book, as mentioned, is about my search for identity as an adopted person in what's known as closed adoption. Closed adoption was the norm for many, many years. It's no longer the norm, but it still happens, and that is an adoption in which the birth parents and the adoptive parents waive their rights to have any information about each other. And so by default, that means that the adopted child or person also does not have any information, which can be problematic if you want to know about your ethnic history or your medical history or anything like that. So in this section of the book, I'm about 29 years old, and I have obtained something from the social worker who in charge of my adoption called non-identifying information, which is a term of art in the adoption world, meaning that it is one thing that they can legally give you, give an adopted person, and it has sort of vague information about your background. So, what ages your parents were when you were born, what ethnicities they were, what kind of field that their parents worked in, those kinds of things, but nothing identifying. So I have that, and I'm starting to think about searching because I have come down with a mysterious illness, and I want to know if I'm a ticking time bomb, if my body is a ticking time bomb. So this is a chapter called "Participate in Your Own Rescue." In 1996, the only legal search method available to adoptees born in Colorado was the Confidential Intermediary Program, created to allow adoptees to hire a state-appointed searcher who would have access to sealed records and classified search tools to find the sought-after person. According to the program's guidelines, the intermediary would locate my birth mother, contact her, and tell her that I was looking for her. At that point, my birth mother could refuse or accept contact. If she refused, any information the searcher had found would be sealed and by law never reopened, and I would have no legal right to any of it. I would never know my birth mother's name or anything about her. But if my birth mother accepted, the intermediary would obtain court-approved permission from both of us to disclose contact information to each other, and we would reunite in a manner of our choosing. I could only focus on the former outcome, that my birth mother would reject me. I couldn't imagine that she would say, "Yes, I want to be found," to a faceless intermediary stranger who phoned to ask if she was my biological mother. The way I saw it, it would be very easy to refuse and hang up forever, and then it would be over, and the records would be resealed, and I would be worse off than I had been before. I couldn't bear the thought that she might be found and I would still be denied access to her. For several years, I had sporadically entertained and then struck down the idea of applying to the intermediary program. I felt powerless to the rules of the intermediary process and the whims of my birth mother, and I hated having so little control over information I truly felt was mine. So I decided to find her myself. I had 10 days of rafting on the Colorado River with friends to think through how to do it. Getting ready for the raft trip, I came across the files of my non-identifying information and notes I had written for pursuing my search. Visiting the genealogy departments of public libraries in small towns in Colorado and the archives at the university I thought my birth mother had attended, and looking at old phone books for listings of irrigation supply businesses that might have belonged to my paternal grandfather. So this is pre-internet 2.0, and it's certainly pre-23andMe. I felt a need to go to Colorado to acquaint myself with the landscape, my original one. I would drive to Colorado after the rafting trip. Perhaps it would be like navigating wilderness. I could find my bearings using the Rocky Mountains and the Great Plains as handrails and follow the contour lines of the Front Range's foothills the same way I had used topographic maps to find my way while hiking. I would travel through the patchworked farm country north of Boulder, where I thought my birth parents had lived, drive the right-angled roads cornering farms and ranches. Motoring around looking for clues would be taking on a new kind of wilderness. On the first day of the river trip, I fell in love with the canyon in a new way. I had been a ranger at the Grand Canyon about 5 years before that and fallen deeply in love with that landscape and really couldn't get it out of my system. All the side canyons our boats rocked past became metaphors for my search. Each canyon seemed like a door that might lead to a discovery, an insight furthering my search. But also on that first day, my love for the canyon was tested. Before sunrise, I had hit the trail into the canyon to join 10 friends from my hometown who had begun their river trip 7 days and 95 miles upriver at Lee's Ferry, a boat launch below the Glen Canyon Dam. To me, the dam seemed like its own kind of closed adoption, creating a blockade that changed the environment of the animals and plants above and below it, separating them from each other. The dam also wrought changes on the river's sediment levels, temperature, and volume. It eroded beach sand that would never redeposit. It endangered native fish by obliterating their habitat. And the reservoir behind the dam, Lake Powell, had drowned canyons, inundating countless archaeological sites, whole villages gone forever. The dam had stolen huge chunks of history, obviously a sensitive spot for me. When I arrived at the river, my friends gave me tips about how to run Grand Canyon Rapids. If I fell out of the boat or the boat flipped over, I should point my feet downstream so I could kick away from rocks and try to swim across to the current to the shore. With that, I hopped into a large inflatable raft, and Suzanne, an oarswoman whom I just met, rowed us out into the current. I wasn't fearful, only because I didn't know what lay ahead. I felt confident I could follow the instructions for handling a boat flip, but I was pretty sure it wouldn't happen. Suzanne, red-haired and 4 months pregnant, sat on a huge cooler full of food for our 10-day trip. Her small baby bump protruded from beneath her shirt as she yanked on the oars. She had been testing herself against the rapids since the launch at Lee's Ferry. I was in awe of her super toughness. Rowing through Grand Canyon while pregnant, I liked her right away. Sitting on one of the raft's air-filled tubes, I chatted with her as she rowed through some flat water. "How's the trip been for you so far?" I nodded at her bump. "It's been harder than I thought," she said, looking at the water to make sure her line through the current was correct. "I get tired a lot more easily than I thought I would, and I keep fantasizing about eating Pringles potato chips. It's all I can think about." There were probably few places in the United States where we had a slimmer chance of getting our hands on a can of Pringles than the bottom of the Grand Canyon. "Wish I could help you with that," I said. "If I'd known, I would have been happy to shove a few cans in my pack before I hiked down here. I've got a plan to throw myself at the mercy of the next commercial boat trip we float by. Pringles for the pregnant is a catchy plea, right?" she said. I laughed, liking her even more. The tricky part about starting a raft trip through the Grand Canyon at the halfway point is that passengers have little time to get their river legs under them before entering some of the canyon's biggest rapids, which are also some of the world's biggest rapids. Suzanne and I glided up to Hermit Rapid, one of the canyon's biggest. Back when I lived on the rim, I had hiked the Hermit Trail down to this rapid, companioned by petrified claw tracks left by ancient reptiles hiking across prehistoric sand dunes, which were now solid rock. Suzanne eddied out, parking the boat above the rapid to scout it and determine the safest route to row through it. I stood on the shore's wet sand with the bow line and bail bucket in hand, watching the rapid's huge undulations. Hermit Rapid is a sequence of giant, hunchbacked waves running down the middle of the channel. She found a line she wanted to take, and we hopped back into the boat. She pulled hard on the oars to position the boat to ride the wave train, and I held the bail bucket at the ready. As we gained the crest of the very first wave, the boat flipped backward. I was thrown into bristling cold water. The current grabbed my limbs and agitated me into the second wave as if I were a dirty shirt in need of washing. The trough of that wave sucked me under. I held my breath as long as I could, hoping the river would release me before I ran out of air. Finally, my head popped up and I gasped for air like a newborn as the river carried me up and over the wave, then dropped me into the next trough. This happened 5 more times. Each time, the current pulled me deeper. I thought my lungs would explode before the river released me to the air, but each time, it freed me just before that happened. I pushed my head out of the freezing water a final time and paddled out of the rapids' aftermath towards the nearest shore, fighting the bulk of the orange life jacket that had kept me from drowning. "Participate in your own rescue," someone yelled. I didn't understand. Kept paddling toward shore. Participate in your own rescue, someone yelled again. I looked up, numbly, still swimming, to see a muscled woman wearing a long-billed cap standing on the edge of our overturned raft, holding a rope she'd rigged to right the boat. She dangled it near me. I recognized her as one of a group of women, kayakers we'd seen who were making their way through the canyon on the same schedule as our group. They had stopped to help when they saw us flip. I flopped onto a boulder in the shallows, attempting to get out of the river and help her right the boat, to do what I'd been told, participate in my own rescue. But I shook uncontrollably from the chill of the 40-degree water and the sheer terror of nearly drowning 7 times. Corey, an oarsman in my group, saw me wobbling toward the rope and grabbed me before I fell, leaving the muscled woman to right the boat herself. I sat on a boulder, shivering, arms wrapped around my knees, teeth chattering from cold and residual adrenaline, and feeling like a total loser. Pregnant Suzanne sat on shore not far from me, also shaken, but unharmed. Had I failed my beloved canyon, or had it failed me? My love affair with it was about 5 years old by then, and although I had hiked and explored many miles of it on foot, I had mostly stayed a respectful distance from the river itself. I loved to swim, and I'd jump into almost any water, but the immense power of the Colorado River had always scared me off. It was hard to find a place to wade in deeper than shin level without the current sweeping me away, without getting my breath stolen by its cold. Days before I drove to the rim, I had called Lutheran Social Services, the agency in Denver that handled my adoption, and made an appointment to meet with Danielle, the social worker who had sent me my non-identifying information. Our meeting was scheduled to take place a few days after my river trip ended. I wondered about Danielle. Would she be grandmotherly, sympathetic to my cause? Or was she a rule follower who would merely reiterate the ambiguous information she'd already given me to keep me from what I wanted? In a history book I brought on the trip, I read that in 1928, newlyweds Glenn and Bessie Hyde set out to raft the Grand Canyon. Bessie wanted to be the first woman in recorded history to complete the trip, but she and her husband never returned, and their boat was found empty in an eddy deep in the canyon, and they were never heard from again. Bessie hadn't just bailed water like me. She had captained. I scrutinized pictures of her standing on their wooden raft, using a pole to guide it along. I imagined her developing muscular arms like the woman who had righted our raft in Hermit Rapid. What had happened to Bessie and her beloved? Their bodies were never recovered, and some people speculated they stole off to Mexico to start anew, but most figured they'd drowned. I liked imagining that they lived on, hidden deep in a remote corner of the canyon, their honeymoon world, that maybe someday they could be found. During stretches of calm water, I sat in the boat, life vest tightly fastened across my chest, as the multi-hued layers of the canyon shifted by. I watched the faraway blue sky framed by the canyon's rims, listening to the silence that abounds below them. And my search plan bobbed alongside me, constantly like an errant paddle. A couple weeks later, in Boulder, Colorado, I readied myself for my appointment with Danielle, the social worker at the agency. Adoption rights advocates I talked with had told me that social workers who were sympathetic to adoptees in search would sometimes meet with them in their offices, then excuse themselves from the room after chatting a bit and leave a piece of paper on the desk that had a scrap of identifying information on it, a birth parent's name, for instance. Of course, I wanted Danielle to be this kind of social worker. But I also had a backup plan to ask a series of questions based on my non-identifying information in hopes that she would slip up and tell me something. Air conditioning slapped me when I walked into the building. In the lobby, Danielle approached me. She was a tall woman in her 60s with short white hair and a gentle smile. "Let's show you around the office," she said. I bit at my lips. I didn't care what the office looked like, but maybe she thought I would envision it as a kind of home since my birth mother had once entered the building, because the names of my birth mother and birth father were written somewhere in a file somewhere within. When I thought about it, I did feel onerous to stand in the building that held definitive information about my origins. I walked alongside Danielle, trying to be polite, nodding, smiling, shaking hands with other social workers, but distracted by my fantasy of tearing around rooms, ripping open file cabinets, grabbing documents, and shoving rolls of microfiche under my shirt. After the tour, Danielle suggested we go somewhere for lunch. My heart raced. I was positive she was communicating to me in code that we couldn't talk about my case while we were in the office, but if we left the building, she would be able to give me the information I sought. She asked me to wait in her office while she collected her things to leave. This might be my chance, I thought. Vacating the office might be her invitation to look around the room for information. I walked in, trembling a bit, hoping and half expecting to see a folder with my name penned in red lying on the Formica tabletop. The tabletop was completely bare. Computer turned off, file cabinet closed. My shoulders slumped. As I tried to muster the nerve to jiggle its handle to see if it was locked, Danielle returned. My body pulsed with disappointment and fear that I wouldn't get any new information from the visit. We walked out into the August noon to a little Mexican restaurant in a strip mall. It was cool and cavernous inside, and it felt like a good place for a secret meeting. A jolt of hope shot through my belly. Danielle asked me where I had grown up. I twisted my napkin under the table. We moved to Northern California when I turned 1. My dad got a job as a professor there, I said. Danielle sipped her water out of its plastic cup. And where do you live now? She asked. I don't live anywhere, I thought. But I said, I've been living in New Mexico, working as a wilderness guide at a small college, and I just got off a rafting trip through the Grand Canyon. I smiled weakly, thinking of the canyon and how lonely I'd felt on the trip. I've heard boating the canyon is a wonderful experience, Danielle replied, smiling. Yes, it was like nothing I've ever done before, I recalled, thinking of the flipped boat in Hermit Rapid, the daydreaming I'd done about this very moment with Danielle. The waitress arrived with my plate of enchiladas and Danielle's burrito and set them on the table. How long have you been working with Lutheran Social Services? I twisted my napkin again. 35 years, if you can believe it. My eyes widened. You were there when I was born? Yes, I was. My heart beat rapidly. Had she seen me when I was an infant? Had she interviewed my birth mother when she placed me for adoption? I'm sorry, I wasn't the social worker assigned to your case. She retired years ago. My heart felt like it was shrinking. Danielle had anticipated my question and shut it down. Still, I wondered if she had seen me as a days-old baby going into foster care, or as a 3-week-old being adopted by my parents. If she had held me, or at least cooed at me while I was bundled up asleep in someone's arms in the agency's waiting room. And if she hadn't, who had held me, fed me, and dressed me when I was a newborn? I had no answers to any of my questions, and no legal right to those answers. Sitting there in the stupid strip mall restaurant, I wanted to tear the neon beer sign off the wall and smash it. Palm sweating, I grabbed my fork to cut a chunk of enchilada, but the fork slipped out of my hand, clattering to the tile floor below the table. Danielle looked up at me, startled. I smiled, took a quick breath. You may have guessed that I've decided to try to search for my birth mother, I said, flagging down the waitress to ask for a new fork. I have a letter signed by my adoptive parents stating their support for my search and asking the agency to help me. I located the dropped fork with my foot and stepped on it, flattening its tines just to feel them bend. Danielle dabbed the corners of her mouth with her napkin. Yes, I assumed you were here because you want to search. I'm glad your parents are sympathetic to your wishes. She gave a too quick smile. I kept my foot on the fork. I also have a letter stating my permission for the agency to give my birth parents my contact information if they're looking for me. Would you put it in my file? Danielle agreed to do it, and I took a deep breath and asked, Has your agency received any word from my birth mother or birth father since my adoption, asking for information about me or providing information about themselves? I held my breath as if it would skew the answer in my favor. Danielle's eyes crinkled a little at the edges. She spoke in a soft voice. I checked your file before you arrived, and there was nothing like that. I'm sorry. My chest tightened. No one was looking for me. In 29 years, no one had even tried, hadn't made the small gesture of sending a letter to the agency. I wondered if my birth parents were dead or in denial of my existence. Maybe they didn't feel they had the right to search for me. My mouth went dry. Is there anything you can tell me to help me with my search? I asked. Danielle folded her paper napkin and placed it on the table. Since your adoption is a closed one, I'm not at liberty to reveal information that would identify your birth parents, she said, her voice still soft. Apparently, our trip to the Mexican restaurant was not a clandestine meeting. It was just lunch. I stopped eating. The cheese in my enchiladas congealed while a voice in my head said, "This is your information. She won't give it to you if you don't ask for it. No one else is going to do this for you." It was difficult to embody the confidence to ask her questions she might refuse to answer. Part of me still felt like an abandoned child who should avoid rocking the boat, should be grateful for being adopted at all. But I took a deep breath and asked her, since both of my mother's parents were Norwegian, did she have a Scandinavian-sounding last name? I cringed a little. I suppose you could say that, she replied. Felt my cheeks flush. It scored a point, albeit a vague one. I also read that she wanted to go to school to be a teacher. I held eye contact with Danielle. The local teachers' college was the Colorado State University at Greeley. Is that where she was enrolled when she became pregnant? She looked me right in the eye. Yes, that's where she was. I sat up a bit taller in the booth. At last, I had one solid piece of information. I had one more question. I hesitated, jiggling my leg. Which letter of the alphabet does my birth mother's surname begin with? The fork slipped from under my foot and clanged against a table leg. Danielle grew still. I can't give you that kind of information. Face red, heart beating fast, I took a sip of my Diet Coke, trying to wash away the feelings of embarrassment and anger. What could I ask now? Nothing. Thank you. So, anybody have any questions?
So if
Did
you
you find out?
Yeah, I'm sorry, is there protocol?
I was just going to say if you could repeat the question after.
Oh, okay,
they ask.
sure, yeah. Yeah.
Did you find out?
Did I find what?
Your parents.
Do you guys want spoilers? Somebody's saying no back there. So, yeah, I guess you can ask.
Buy the book.
You can ask me later, even if you don't buy the book. But of course, I want you to buy the book. Anybody else have questions? Yeah.
The non-identifying information, I was adopted in Massachusetts, and I got something similar from the social worker, but it was a form, and it had been blacked out.
Oh, it was redacted.
Redacted.
Yeah.
Was that similar?
That's a good question. So he's asking if the non-identifying information was a original sheet that had redactions on it, which is very dramatic sounding. But mine was, no, it was like cold information. So they had some form somewhere, and they had just taken information from it and kind of typed up a little narrative, which I found out later lots of it wasn't true.
Same here.
Yeah, which apparently is part of the way things worked back then. They would just kind of make up, an all-American story of who these people were and who you might be, and so it's very interesting. Yeah, in the back.
Have the adoption laws changed enough so that people can pursue this more easily?
That's a great question. So have the adoption laws changed much so that people can pursue a search more easily? Interestingly, it depends on what state you were born in. It is up to the states, as certain other things are right now. Some states, an adopted person has been allowed to have their information from the age of 18 forever. Some states, things have opened up more recently, so and everything in between. Some states you still can't, you have no rights at all. Recently, Colorado changed its laws so that I can obtain my original birth certificate. So one thing that happened back in the day was they would amend your birth certificate. So my birth certificate that I've had my whole life says I was born at hospital, delivered by doctor, and my adoptive parents are my parents, which is pretty weird, right? And so I recently got my original birth certificate that has my birth mom's name on it. Yeah. So it really, things seem to be opening up slowly, but it's definitely not like a blanket yes to your question. Yeah. Anybody else? Yeah.
This obviously is a memoir. What other writing do you do? Do you do other genres? Do you find memoir special in a particular way? I want to know about your process.
That's a really lovely question for me. So I started out as a poet. So any other poets here? I bet there are. Yeah. So, and I even went to grad school for poetry. I have a master's degree in creative writing, and I wrote a whole manuscript as my thesis. A lot of it is about this kind of stuff. And I think it's a pretty good manuscript, but my husband, my best supporter over there, but almost as soon as I finished my degree, I was like, I'm not sure that was the right genre for this content. And so I turned around and started trying to figure out how to write memoir, because I really felt like it needed to be told in a very narrative form and not necessarily as lyrically as I had in my manuscript. So I love poetry, and this book actually has a lot of love for poetry in it. A lot of beautiful quotes from poets that I love. But memoir, I've mostly been writing personal essay and memoir for the last several years, just because I'm really enthralled with the power of story. And it seems like the more I think about the power of story, the more powerful things I start to understand about it, about the way that that story can reach people. And I would love to write fiction. I'm not sure I'm good enough at making stuff up. Does that answer your question? Okay, how about in the back, and then you, yeah.
Can you tell us a little more about the book, beginning, middle, end? What kind of stuff do you cover?
Sure, so...
and I got distracted there. I don't know whether to ask whether it rhymes or not.
It definitely does not rhyme. That's beyond me. So as you may know, memoir is different from autobiography.
No.
Oh, okay. So first of all, I need to repeat the question because I almost forgot. So he's asking, what period of time does the memoir cover? One of the things that's different about memoir than autobiography is that autobiography generally spans a person's entire life. I guess up until the time they write it. and memoir usually selects a particular time period that is important for some reason. And so this is roughly spans the decade from my mid-20s to my mid-30s, when I was starting to strike out on my own and try to figure out what kind of jobs I was going to have, which led me to work at the Grand Canyon as a ranger and things like that. And how that, search for identity as a young adult in the world also really twinned itself or paired itself with my need to figure out my identity as a biological person in the world. And so the search for my birth parents, birth families, and my work in the outdoors as a wilderness guide, as an environmental educator, etc., they occurred during the same decade. And so the book kind of explores the whys and hows of that. And it just is encompassed pretty much by that decade. And how about you?
Can you tell a little bit about your New Mexico job? And I'm from New Mexico.
Oh.
And I like to hear about
Yeah,
that.
sure. So she wants to know about my New Mexico job. So there is a wonderful little international school in a tiny little place outside of a relatively small town called Las Vegas, New Mexico. So I'm not talking about Las Vegas that we all know. This Las Vegas, New Mexico is about, oh gosh, I don't even know, 90 miles east of Santa Fe. And outside of that town is a little teeny town called Montezuma that houses the United World College of the American West, which is an international baccalaureate school. So it's really just for like 18 and 19-year-olds. And it has a focus on bringing people in from all over the world. So when I was there in the mid-90s, there were 200 students from 80 countries. And there's a series of, or not a series, like there's a network of these schools all over the world. Like they're in Wales and they're in, Latin America, and they're all over the place. And so the emphasis is on this IB curriculum, which often helps people get into like fancy schools in the U.S. But because of the location of this one, because it's in this remote location, its sort of secondary focus is wilderness travel and wilderness safety. And so students have to participate in a certain amount of wilderness trips, and so there has to be a wilderness teacher, and that was me. And that's where the search and rescue thing comes in too, because the school performs service by training its students to do search and rescue for the state of New Mexico. And so I was a search and rescue leader for our little team from the World College. And we would go out, at all hours of the night searching for people lost up in the Santa Fe ski bowl, hiking, and all kinds of stuff. So it was wild.
So it didn't get impacted by the fire?
Well, it's interesting that you ask. So
I was there when
this,
that fire was
yeah. So you know that, yeah, that's bad.
Yeah.
So the school was evacuated. So this was, I was there years ago, but this was. They had to evacuate the school, and it burned the wilderness right behind the school. The recent fire. Yeah, it's right there. Yeah, I'm not sure I want to go see it. It's a beautiful place. Anybody else? Yeah.
I read that that the book is not necessarily, the events are not necessarily in the order that they happened, that you maybe reordered some of them. So I was wondering how you chose how you chose to order your book.
Yeah. So this is a big conversation in memoir. Is it okay to telescope events or telescope even characters? Like make three humans in your life into one character in your book, or make two events into one event, and Mary Carr, who you might be familiar with, a lovely poet and memoirist, is like, no, you cannot. And other people who are famous memoir arbiters say, yeah, you can. And so it's a big debate. I went on lots of different trips that were kind of similar to each other. So sometimes I would just like compact, things that happened on different trips into one trip, because who wants to hear about it? And then the next wilderness trip I went on, we did, we ate noodles, and then we, so that's the kind of thing the kind of decisions that I made about that. Yeah, but I believe it's really important to stay really, really close to the truth, which is tricky nonetheless because memory is fallible, very fallible. And so what I remember is not going to be exactly the same as what somebody else who was there remembers. So memoir is funny that way. Yeah, it's a funny business. And like I said, I had to figure out how to do it because I had to go to school for it. And yeah.
You don't have to have a poem to read to us.
Oh, shoot. You know, I thought about bringing one because I thought, oh, it'd be nice to juxtapose. Yeah, but I don't have one with me. But I can send you one if you want.
We're actually a poetry club, and so we thought this was poetry. Which I'm glad you came. It was very fascinating. We're like, oh yeah, this is the poetry. So then we said poetry. I'm like, oh, maybe she.
Yeah. Well, like I said, the book has a lot of poetry in it, but I don't have any poems with me. I'm sorry. Anybody else? Yeah.
I do like your quoting that woman twice. Participate in your own rescue, and how annoyed she was.
I'm glad that came through. Well, it was a very funny thing to be hearing at that time, and of course it was. In fact, I was practicing on the drive up here, and my son was like, "What was that about? What was she yelling at you about?" And I was, it's part of boating safety culture is that you have to know how to rescue yourself. But as an adopted person who's like struggling to find and heal themselves, it was such a metaphor for me to have somebody yelling, "Participate in rescue." I was like, as I was thinking of searching, I'm like, I guess this is the universe telling me you have to go do this because nobody else is going to do it for you. Yeah. So she asked what point of my childhood did I decide I wanted to find my biological parent. I was raised in a loving family. I always knew I was adopted. They did not hide that from me. It was very normalized. And so I just really didn't think about it that much until I turned 20 and I got really sick. And I thought, they couldn't really figure out what was wrong with me. And I thought, oh, this would be a good time to have some medical history, and I have nothing. So that's actually what drove me to get my non-identifying information. It's like, can you tell me if there's like heart disease in my family or anything? And nothing came up. And so then it was just like lodged in my brain. And
yeah, I'm just curious whether in your adopted family you had siblings at all.
yeah, so in my adoptive family, did I have siblings? I grew up with two brothers who were younger than me. One is adopted, and the other one was biologically born to my parents. So, yeah. So they don't appear too much in the book because they have their own stories, and I do believe that it's important to not tell other people's stories. That's another tricky thing about memoir is, what is yours to tell and what isn't. And also, what secrets are you going to tell that other people do not want you to tell, but you feel that you must because it is your truth. And so this book took me a long time to write because I had to really get over the fear of alienating other people with, the truths of my own struggles with being adopted and with not knowing, who I came from.
You mentioned secrets. It is the cover story on Psychology Today on the newsstand. You can read that.
So Secrets is the cover story on Psychology Today. And is there a tagline to that? Like, secrets, they are very bad.
Secrets, that's the title. You can read that.
So, yeah, and there's lots of
Some
secrecy.
people lie about them, but I won't lead you too far into the story.
Yeah, and there's so much secrecy and shame surrounding the issue of adoption because of its origins and all kinds of stuff. And part of my drive to write this book was to shine light on those secrets, to expose them to the light, to try to dispel some of that. Because it's still, even though things are much more open now and there's far less stigmatization of people who get pregnant outside of marriage, etc., it's still kind of it's a weird thing that we don't know how to talk about or deal with as much. Yeah.
Was it a clue at all that it was Lutheran?
She's asked if it was a clue for me that it was Lutheran social services that I was adopted through. Definitely, yeah. And and my adoptive parents were Lutheran, which is why they went there. But definitely you can, as a, if you're searching and you think, oh, probably why would you choose Lutheran social services if you weren't Lutheran associated in some way? So that helped to narrow it down.
Well, thank you very much.
Oh, thank you so much for your great support. So do we go straight into your open mic now?
Yes.
Great.
Yep. I just want to say thank you again for the people streaming or watching on YouTube, and definitely tune in again September 10th for Eileen Casanetto. And now it is time for our open mic.